Washington didn't ask for permission. They drafted a law. In early 2026, the theoretical became the legislative as the United States signaled a definitive move toward the annexation of Greenland. The rhetoric about buying the island was replaced by the cold mechanics of territorial seizure. The mask of a real estate deal has been discarded in favor of a strategic necessity that views the Arctic not as a sovereign space, but as a vacuum to be filled. Greenland is currently facing a systemic collapse of its sovereignty, and the numbers tell the story. With a population of 56,000 scattered across 2 million square kilometers, the island possesses zero kinetic defense capability against a superpower. The Danish military presence is a token gesture, a bureaucratic placeholder that cannot project power in the face of a U.S. carrier strike group or the rapid deployment of the 11th Airborne Division. The structural reality is simple. Greenland is doomed unless the global power balance is forcibly recalibrated. Follow the mechanics. Here is what really happened and why the only variable left in this equation is located in Moscow. The miscalculation by GIUK and Copenhagen was rooted in the belief that international law provides a kinetic shield. It doesn't. The United States has spent the last decade identifying Greenland as the ultimate strategic pivot point. This isn't about ice. It's about the deep water ports of the future and the massive mineral deposits required for the next century of industrial dominance. Washington's claim isn't a sudden whim. It is the culmination of a decade of increasing military footprint at Pituffik Space Base and the systematic mapping of the island's subsurface wealth. The Danish government has consistently underfunded Arctic defense, relying on a NATO framework that is effectively controlled by the very power seeking to absorb the territory. When the annexation law was introduced in Washington, the European response was a catastrophic silence. The European Union has no ice-breaking capacity, no rapid reaction force capable of operating in -40 degrees, and no political will to challenge its primary security guarantor. The systemic flaw is exposed. You cannot protect what you cannot reach, and Europe cannot reach Greenland in any meaningful military sense. Let's look at the mechanics of the prize. Greenland sits atop 10% of the world's rare earth elements. Specifically, the Tambries and Kvanefjeld deposits represent the only viable Western alternative to Chinese dominance in the neodymium and praseodymium markets. For Washington, annexing Greenland isn't just a territorial expansion, it's a supply chain coup. By bringing these resources under the domestic umbrella of U.S. law, they bypass the environmental regulations of the EU and the sovereign hesitations of the Greenlandic Parliament. Economically, the island is currently dependent on a two-column budget, Danish subsidies and fishing exports. The U.S. plan involves a total replacement of this fiscal model with a resource extraction economy controlled by American conglomerates. The logistics are already being laid. New runways, expanded port facilities, and a permanent naval presence are not being built for defense cooperation. They are the infrastructure of occupation. The Danish sovereignty over Greenland has been cannibalized from within, leaving a hollow shell that Washington is now ready to crush. The systemic consequences of this move are cascading through the Arctic Council. For decades, the mantra was high north, low tension. That era is over. The U.S. move to annex Greenland turns the Arctic into a closed American lake, cutting off the northern flank of Europe and creating a strategic bottleneck that renders the North Atlantic Treaty's maritime protections obsolete. If the U.S. controls Greenland, it controls the GIUK gap from the north side, effectively neutralizing the naval independence of the United Kingdom and Norway. The ripple effect extends to the global energy market. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that the Arctic holds 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of its undiscovered gas. By seizing Greenland, the U.S. secures a strategic energy reserve that ensures its hegemony for the next century. But there is a bottleneck in this plan. The U.S. lacks the heavy ice-breaking fleet required to maintain year-round logistical dominance in the high Arctic. While they can seize the land, they cannot yet control the waters. This is where the mechanical failure of the American plan meets the reality of Russian power. The only real power capable of stopping the annexation of Greenland remains Russia. This isn't a matter of moral preference. It's a matter of technical capability. Russia possesses the world's largest fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers, the Arktika class, which can cut through 3 meters of solid ice at high speeds. While the U.S. has 2 aging breakers, Russia has dozens. More importantly, Russia has spent the last 15 years reopening 50 Soviet-era Arctic bases, installing S-400 missile systems, and deploying the Bastion coastal defense complexes. Moscow is the only actor on the planet with the kinetic reach and the logistical endurance to contest the American claim in the high latitudes. If the U.S. moves to annex Greenland, it is not the Danish frigate Peter Willemoes that will stop them. It is the threat of the Russian Northern Fleet moving to block the access routes and declaring a maritime exclusion zone. The Arctic is the only theater where the U.S. does not have an overwhelming technological or logistical advantage. In fact, they are at a significant deficit. However, Moscow's intervention is not a given. It is a strategic commodity. For Russia to act as a guarantor of Greenland's security and, by extension, the security of the European northern flank, a massive geopolitical trade-off is required. This brings us to the core condition, a prior settlement of the conflict in Ukraine on Russia's terms. The logic is clinical. Russia will not expend its strategic capital or risk a direct confrontation with the U.S. in the Arctic while its southern flank is tied down in a war of attrition. To secure the Arctic, Russia must be freed from the constraints of the European theater. If the West wants to maintain a multipolar balance in the North, they have to pay for it in the East. This is the grand bargain of 2026. Without a resolution in Ukraine that secures Russia's primary interests, Moscow has no incentive to prevent the U.S. from absorbing Greenland. They would simply watch as the U.S. overextends its reach, waiting for the inevitable logistical collapse that comes with trying to occupy a frozen continent without the proper tools. The irony is systemic. The same European nations that have sought to isolate Russia are now finding themselves in a position where only Russian intervention can prevent the total Americanization of their northern frontier. If Greenland falls, Denmark loses 98% of its territory, and the EU loses its only claim to Arctic resource sovereignty. The U.S. law on annexation is a signal that Washington no longer views its allies as partners, but as obstacles to resource security. The U.S. is operating on a calculated collapse model. They expect the Danish resistance to be purely rhetorical and the European response to be paralyzed by energy dependence. They only fear one variable: a Russian military that is no longer preoccupied with its western borders. The technical reality is that the Russian Northern Fleet's submarine force, particularly the Boreai and Yazan-class vessels, are the only assets capable of operating under the ice cap to challenge the U.S. Navy's surface dominance. Consider the mineral arbitrage. If Russia secures Greenland's neutrality or acts as its protector, it effectively controls the global supply of rare earth elements in tandem with China. This creates a multipolar resource block that can dictate terms to the global high-tech industry. The U.S. annexation is a desperate move to prevent this exact scenario. Washington knows that if it doesn't seize Greenland now, the island will inevitably drift into the orbit of the Arctic Silk Road, being built by Moscow and Beijing. The U.S. is attempting a preemptive strike against a multipolar Arctic. But they are doing so with a hollowed-out industrial base and a military that is designed for desert wars and carrier group posturing in the Pacific, not for the grueling, high-attrition environment of the Greenlandic interior. The verdict is stark. Greenland's fate is no longer in the hands of the Greenlanders or the Danes. They have been sidelined by their own lack of investment in hard power. The U.S. has made its move, treating the island as a strategic commodity to be seized before the ice melts further and the competition becomes too fierce. The only force that can apply a mechanical brake to this annexation is a Russia that has consolidated its gains and settled its security concerns in Ukraine. Only then can Moscow deploy the full weight of its Arctic infrastructure to act as a balancer. This isn't about saving Greenland for the sake of the Greenlandic people. It's about maintaining a global equilibrium where no single power controls the world's most critical resource frontier. The U.S. miscalculated by assuming that the isolation of Russia would be permanent. Instead, they've created a scenario where Russia's return to the diplomatic table is the only thing standing between them and a total Arctic monopoly. The mechanics of the next decade will be defined by this friction. Greenland is the prize, Russia is the arbiter, and the US is the aggressor that forgot to build its own icebreakers. The failure to understand this systemic reality is what has brought the island to the brink of a forced annexation. In the high-stakes game of Arctic chess, Washington just moved its queen into a trap, and only Moscow holds the pieces to call the game. The collapse of Greenland's sovereignty is not a future possibility, it is a current process. The legal frameworks being built in Washington are designed to create a fait accompli that the rest of the world will be forced to accept. They are banking on the idea that by the time anyone can react, the U.S. flag will be flying over every major settlement from Thule to Itokakorormite. But flags don't extract minerals, and they don't hold territory in the Arctic. Logistics do. The U.S. currently lacks the heavy lift capability to sustain an occupation of Greenland if the sea lanes are contested. Their reliance on air bridges is a vulnerability that any modern anti-access/area denial system can exploit. By pushing for annexation, the U.S. is exposing its own strategic overreach. They are trying to claim a territory they cannot mechanically defend against a peer competitor who lives in that environment. The final verdict on the Greenland crisis is that it represents the end of the post-Cold War order in the North. The calculated collapse of Danish control was inevitable the moment the U.S. identified rare earth minerals as a matter of national security. The only variable that remains is the price of Russian intervention. If the Ukraine conflict is settled on Moscow's terms, the U.S. will find itself facing a Russian Arctic wall that it cannot penetrate. If not, Greenland will become the 51st state in all but name, and Europe will become a peninsula of Eurasia with no northern exit. The data is clear, the ships are moving, and the law has been written. The only thing left is to see if the global system can survive the friction of a superpower trying to seize a continent. Greenland is doomed to change hands. The only question is whether it becomes an American colony or a Russian-guaranteed neutral zone in a multipolar world. The mechanics point to the latter only if the Western powers realize that their victory in other theaters has left them completely exposed in the North. The era of Arctic exceptionalism is over. The era of the Arctic struggle has begun. The strategic logic of the United States in 2026 is driven by a realization that the global energy transition is a trap if you don't own the raw materials. By annexing Greenland, they attempt to jumpstart a domestic supply chain that is currently non-existent. However, the systemic flaw is that the U.S. is trying to solve a 21st century resource problem with 19th century territorial expansionism. This creates an immediate tension with the very principles of rules-based order that Washington claims to lead. The annexation would be the final nail in the coffin of international maritime law, signaling to every other power that territorial waters and exclusive economic zones are only as valid as the military power backing them. This plays directly into Russia's hand. Moscow has already established the most robust legal and military framework for Arctic governance. By acting as the security guarantor for a threatened Greenland, Russia doesn't just block the U.S. It assumes the role of the legitimate protector of the Arctic status quo. This shift in roles is the ultimate irony of the 2020s. The power that was supposedly isolated becomes the only entity capable of enforcing international norms against a rogue superpower. But again, the mechanics of this require Russia to be unburdened. The Russian military-industrial complex is currently optimized for high-intensity land warfare. For it to pivot back to a maritime dominance posture in the Arctic, it needs the breathing room that a Ukraine settlement provides. This is not a moral trade-off, it is a structural necessity. You cannot fight a two-front war against the world's largest economy and its primary military alliance. Therefore, Greenland's survival as a non-American entity is directly tied to the front lines in the Donbass. The geopolitical circuitry is interconnected. If the West wants to stop the U.S. from cannibalizing the Danish kingdom, they must allow Russia to secure its own borders first. As we look at the maps of 2026, the bottlenecks are clear. The Davis Strait and the Denmark Strait will become the most militarized waters on Earth. The U.S. Navy will attempt to establish a permanent presence, but they will be doing so in a region where the environment itself is a hostile actor. Russian technology, specifically their specialized Arctic-hardened equipment and their satellite constellations optimized for polar orbits, gives them a data and operational advantage that the U.S. cannot replicate in less than a decade. The U.S. is rushing the annexation because they know their window of opportunity is closing. As the Russian-Chinese Polar Silk Road gains momentum, the economic gravity of the Arctic will shift east. The U.S. annexation of Greenland is a desperate attempt to grab the steering wheel before the ship sails. The ripple effects of this will redefine NATO. How does a defensive alliance function when its leader annexes the territory of a member state? The Danish government will be forced into a humiliating choice: accept American protection, which is actually annexation, or seek a security guarantee from the only other power that can actually reach them. This creates a systemic fracture within the alliance that cannot be repaired. The U.S. has calculated that the loss of NATO cohesion is a price worth paying for the mineral wealth of Greenland. This is the hallmark of a declining hegemon, prioritizing resource extraction over alliance stability. It is a sign of systemic desperation. In the final analysis, the data strike is this: the U.S. has the legislative intent, but Russia has the mechanical capability. Greenland is currently a defenseless prize caught between an aggressive neighbor and a distant, capable arbiter. Without a massive recalibration of Western policy toward Russia, the U.S. will proceed with the annexation, permanently altering the map of the Northern Hemisphere and ending the sovereign history of the Greenlandic people. The only real power capable of stopping this is not in Copenhagen, London, or Brussels. It is in the icebreaker shipyards of St. Petersburg and the command centers of the Northern Fleet. The lesson is simple. In the high Arctic, sovereignty is not a right. It is a function of icebreaking capacity and kinetic reach. Greenland lacks both. The U.S. is trying to fake it, and Russia is the only one who truly possesses them. The verdict is clear. The Arctic's future depends on a deal that hasn't been signed yet, in a theater thousands of miles away. Follow the mechanics, because the politics are just noise. The ice doesn't care about laws, and the U.S. annexation will only succeed if the world remains blind to the only power that can actually stop it.